The Watership Down podcast is intended for listeners who are familiar with the plot. There will be spoilers. This episode is scripted, narrated, recorded and edited by Newell Fisher. Hello, and welcome to the Watership Down podcast episode 167, in which we will be looking at part 1 of the 2002 British Broadcasting Corporation radio play. In doing so, we are making a very firm return to originalism, which actually feels quite refreshing. But first, let's set the scene. Audio drama and the BBC in context. Before I begin looking at the two BBC radio versions of Watership Down, I feel some context is needed, particularly for those of you who do not live in the UK. Sorry if that sounds patronising, but you know what we Brits are like. The British Broadcasting Corporation was founded in 1922 under a royal charter and is the world's oldest broadcaster. It is advert-free and is state-funded by a licence fee that is payable by any household or organisation watching or recording live television in the UK, even if they do not watch BBC programmes. However, you do not need a licence to listen to BBC radio. Because of the way it is funded, access to BBC television programmes is restricted outside the UK, where its output is marketed on a commercial basis. However, BBC domestic radio output appears to be freely available online. At the outbreak of the Second World War, the BBC amalgamated its radio services into the Home Service and the Overseas Service, which became the BBC World Service in 1965 and continues to this day. There were also light entertainment services aimed at the armed forces. After the war, these became the BBC Light programme, which was music-based, while the Home Service remained as a speech-based radio station. A third programme was also introduced that focused on classical music and culture. In the 1978 film of Watership Down, during Hazel and Pipkin's initial raid of Nuthanger Farm, we briefly hear the Home Service on the farmer's radio, which is the clue that Pipkin uses to point out that the farmer is awake. The timestamp for this is 33 minutes 50. On September 30th, 1967, the BBC's domestic radio output was restructured, which is how we know that the 1978 film is set before September 30th, 1967. The Light programme was split into BBC Radio 1 and Radio 2, which focused on popular music, while the third programme became Radio 3, focusing on classical music. However, the Home Service was renamed BBC Radio 4 and remained speech-based. This structure remains in place to this day, 57 years later, with the only adjustments being the addition of online and digital stations, still largely based around the four-station structure, for example, Radio 4 Extra. The four post-1967 national BBC radio stations are institutions in their own right. For those of us of a certain age in this country, one or more of them have a good chance of being a part of treasured memories of our childhoods and early adulthoods. For me personally, as I was only 7 months old when it was renamed, that station is very much Radio 4, which is unusual as a radio station, as its output has always remained far more like that of a general output television station than the majority of radio stations. And, getting to the point, a major element of this has always been its extensive drama output. The 2002 BBC Radio 4 radio play of Watership Down was as typical an example of that drama output as you could hope to hear. However, having re-listened to both the 2002 and 2016 radio plays, a fascinating contrast between them has become apparent. In 2002, if you wanted to listen to radio drama, you had very limited options. You either bought it on cassette or compact disc or on vintage vinyl, or you listened to it on a radio. The RSS feed that made podcasts possible was only just becoming a thing and would not become widely used until 2005. The company Audible, who are not sponsoring me by the way, was 1 year away from making a deal with Apple to be the exclusive provider of audiobooks to their online store, and 3 years away from launching a service that allowed their content to be downloaded directly to smartphones. In this context, if I were to be charitable, audio drama could have been described as having been a niche interest in the UK at the time. And when I say niche, I mean that I strongly suspect that the younger you were, the less likely you were to be listening to it. If I were to be less charitable, I would say that audio drama was becoming a dying art form. The 2002 radio play of Watership Down seems to reflect that by having overall production values that were below those of the 2016 version. Let me be clear that this comment has absolutely nothing to do with the interpretation of Watership Down, the quality of the scripts, the direction or the standard of the performances. In both cases they are of roughly the same quality in my opinion. The key difference between the two was in the quality and extent of incidental music and the amount of narration. This may seem trivial, but it really does make a difference. In the 2002 version, one main musical refrain is used throughout the performance. It is a beautiful violin theme that I cannot criticise in the context of the time in which it was made. In fact, the 2002 radio play was a good example of Radio 4 drama at that time. At that time as well, I seem to remember that Radio 4 audio dramas tended to avoid using much narration. It was almost as if doing so would be to admit that the audio-only medium was somehow inadequate and required narration to fill in the gaps. However, if we wind forward to 2016, a real difference is very apparent. By 2016, podcasts were ubiquitous. Audible, who I must repeat are not sponsoring me, had just started expanding their content to include podcasts, and crucially, over the last few years, this has expanded to include original audio drama. At the time of writing, Audible.com, as it is now known, is playing a significant role in making audio drama popular again, and for a younger audience. In fact, recently in the UK, they spent what must have been significant amounts of money on an advertising campaign to promote their audio drama of George Orwell's 1984, which is available for free to subscribers on their platform. Speaking personally, their serialisation of The Sandman has also been a real highlight. These dramas have been provided for free to subscribers, yet their production values are very high and their casts are very impressive. To be absolutely clear, Audible.com is not a charity. They are doing this in order to make money. I absolutely cannot imagine an advertising campaign having been used in 2002 to promote a radio play, nor, frankly, in 2016. I may be wrong about that. Please let me know if I am. This means that there is now a lot of money in audio drama, to the extent that a multinational corporation can now offer high-quality content as a freebie to its subscribers using famous actors in significant roles. But, returning to our earlier contrast between the two BBC radio plays of Watership Down, what is the nature of that high-quality content? Put crudely, the more modern audio dramas sound a lot more like movies. They make extensive use of high-quality background music throughout, and they do not shy away from using narration to fill in some of the gaps due to the lack of visuals. For a modern audience, by which I suppose I mean those born in the last 40 years, such elements are probably regarded as a given. However, in the 2002 version of Watership Down, these elements were almost entirely absent. I don't know for certain, but I'm betting that this was due, put crudely, to the limited budgets available for BBC radio drama in 2002. Making extensive original film-quality music for a radio production costs money, far more than just hiring a lone violinist. However, by 2016, audio-based entertainment was making a comeback, due to such phenomena as podcasts and Audible.com, and I am betting that as a result, the BBC was feeling able to devote more resources to such productions. Because of this, the 2016 BBC radio play of Watership Down would easily hold its own on Audible.com in 2024, but, sadly, the 2002 version would not. And that, to repeat myself, has nothing to do with the quality of the scripts, or the direction, or performances of the actors. It comes down purely to the extent and quality of the background music and the use of narration. So, having said all the above, here is the final irony. Neither of these BBC radio productions are available for download from the BBC. If you want to listen to them now, you will have to resort to sources that, frankly, breach copyright. Both productions are searchable on the BBC website, but it is made clear that they are currently unavailable. This is the same website that recently, and very wisely, made the entire Doctor Who archive available domestically for free, much of which, and here I am very aware I will infuriate fans of Doctor Who, frankly isn't very impressive by modern standards in terms of production values, though the creative ideas are still impressive. So, to return to my point, why doesn't the BBC do the same with their extensive archive of state-funded audio dramas? I'll leave that question hanging in the air. Oh, hold on. No, I won't. I will actually close this section by making it clear that the images for these episodes of this podcast combine two elements: the official logos of BBC Radio 4 at the time they were made, and the current images on the BBC website that accompany the information on both productions. You might very well conclude that both images are less than adequate. And remember, if you are a UK citizen aged over 40 who watches TV, then you literally paid for both of these legally unavailable versions of Watership Down to be made. So shouldn't you be able to hear them? Anyway, rant over for now. Let's start looking at the 2002 BBC radio play of Watership Down. The 2002 BBC Radio 4 radio play, Part 1. Part 1 of the 2002 BBC radio play of Watership Down was first broadcast on Saturday the 5th of October 2002 on BBC Radio 4. Its last broadcast was on Thursday 19th of December 2013 on BBC Radio 4 Extra. It was dramatised for radio by Newell Fisher, MBE, who was honoured for his many years of work in broadcasting in 2006. He also abridged the 1997 audiobook of Watership Down, which was read by Andrew Sachs. It was directed by theatre, TV and radio director Peter Leslie Wilde. You can listen to Part 1 on YouTube at the Lapine Radio Play archive. There will be a link in the notes. The story opens on Watership Down with a rabbit who I think is intended to be an elderly dandelion telling a group of younger rabbits about how they came to live on Watership Down. It is clearly many seasons and even a few years since the events of the book. As one of the rare bits of narration in this version, it is effective and also lets those listening who might not be familiar with the book know that the characters are all rabbits. This is followed by a musical interlude during which the play is introduced, and we are told the music is by Chris Leslie, a single violinist who provides the only music throughout. Newell Fisher is also credited as the scriptwriter. And then we are immediately in the burrow of the Threarrah, the chief rabbit of Sandalford Warren. Bigwig is showing Hazel and Fiver in, and warns Hazel not to mumble. This Threarrah follows the usual convention of being an officer-class elderly rabbit who clearly used to be highly capable but is now well past his best. He also makes a coded reference in his tone to having known Hazel's mother in a way that suggests they were more than passing acquaintances. Having sorted out who they are, Hazel gets down to the point. Fiver, while small, is very talented, he says, in the psychic area. This direct reference to supernatural powers is the first divergence from the novel, in which Hazel merely lays out the facts about how Fiver can often tell in advance when bad things are going to happen. The Threarrah doesn't immediately reject the possibility of such powers. However, when Fiver tries to explain a dream he has had, he is sceptical. This dream refers to the field in which a notice board has appeared. Rather than appearing covered in blood, when he sees this notice board, Fiver has just dreamt that the field was covered in dead bodies and that it was then torn apart and he couldn't get away. The notice board itself has not traumatised him. In the book, it is a very different dream, after his terrifying vision at the notice board, that finally motivates Hazel to take him to see the Chief Rabbit. The reasons for the Threarrah rejecting Fiver's proposal that they must all leave the warren are similar to the book, and Hazel has to lead his choking, panicking brother away. The Threarrah then has a word in Officer Bigwig's floppy, as he puts it, and reveals his harder side. We then hear the first ever dramatic portrayal of Bigwig resigning from the Owsler, after the Threarrah threatens to have him kicked out of the warren as well as the Owsler if he ever does anything like this again. The Threarrah realises he has gone too far. It is now later, and Bigwig is meeting with Hazel and Fiver. It is clear he was hating being in the Owsler anyway. Hazel makes it clear that they are leaving that night. Bigwig says he will join them. Blackberry is the next volunteer and says he will try to persuade his friend Pipkin to come along. Bigwig says he will sound out the Owsler. His earlier involvement with leaving Sandalford is very true to the book. They will leave Fewinley after moonrise. The reason for this is that the entire Owsler will be on patrol before then. After a musical interlude, we are at the gathering of those who will be leaving Sandalford. Hazel, Fiver and Pipkin are already there. Then Dandelion turns up with Hawkbit, who does not speak. This is all very close to the book, except that Pipkin was a friend of Fiver's, not Blackberry's, and Hawkbit turned up just ahead of Dandelion. Dandelion gives the same warning about the Owslet and Toadflax, and then Blackberry turns up with Buckthorn, Speedwell and Acorn. They are followed by Bigwig and Silver. Captain Holly then arrives to arrest just Bigwig and Silver as Owslet members, and is immediately attacked by Bigwig. After Hazel tells him to go or he will be killed, the same group of 11 buck rabbits leave Sandalford as in the book. This is the first dramatic account ever of the rabbits who leave Sandalford that is completely true to it, though the 1984 ABC play did state that 11 left, though only 8 were mentioned at the time. Sorry to be so pedantic about this, but I've always tried to be completely accurate about the initial group who leave Sandalford. As a touching addition to the book, Hazel very happily announces that there are rare of them, meaning more than 4. After a musical interlude, we come to the first major departure from the book, as the entire episode in the wood is missed out, and we find ourselves on the bank of the River Emborn. Bigwig is more agreeable to swimming the river than in the book. In fact, all round he hasn't got the edge of the original Bigwig. Bigwig immediately spots the dog, and the crossing of the Emborn proceeds in summarised form, and without Bigwig threatening to leave Fiver and Pipkin behind. It is now much later on, and the rabbits are travelling over open country on the other side of the Emborn in quite a strung-out formation. There has been no crow attack, no beanfield, and no road. It is night time, and in the moonlight Fiver points out the distant ridge of the high hills as the place they need to get to. In the book, he first suggests this at the Emborn without seeing the hills. Then later he sees them in the distance on the heath, just before Bigwig bites Hawkbit for asking who is Chief Rabbit. But not this Bigwig. Though they are finding the going difficult, these rabbits are not going through the same trauma as in the book. Fiver then sees the mist between them and the hills, a mist they must go through. After a musical interlude, they find themselves in a better situation, though rain is on the way, and Hazel says they should dig a few scrapes. Bigwig and Blackberry arrive back from a patrol to report that there is no sign of a Lil, apart from humans, which isn't so bad. In the novel, Bigwig went with Silver and Buckthorn. And then they see another rabbit watching them. Hazel and Blackberry go to meet him. This, of course, is Cowslip, and he sounds normal. There is none of the eccentricity with which he had been usually portrayed in the past, and in a way, if you are familiar with the plot, this makes him even more frightening. In fact, to me, this Cowslip seems far more as he is described in the book, with nothing immediately alarming about him except his size. Bigwig shows a hard edge towards Cowslip, and Fiver is immediately suspicious. After a much summarised discussion as to whether to go to Cowslip's warren, they set off. After a musical interlude, we are in the stranger's warren. The visitors wonder at the huge burrow that will later inspire the honeycomb. Strawberry introduces himself and Nildro Hayne, and actually sounds more suspicious than Cowslip to me. Nildro Hayne, as in the book, does not speak. Strawberry's conversation with Hazel, in which he explains that the man kills all the ill and that they have many empty burrows, more or less follows the book, and gives a couple of opportunities for Strawberry to avoid questions starting with where. He also talks about the food they keep underground, ending with telling the still silent Nildro Hayne to bring out the goodies. This Strawberry is not at all likeable. After a musical interlude, we hear Hazel talk to Blackberry about concerns he is already having with this warren. This is earlier than in the book. We also hear Strawberry shouting that there is flayra, accompanied by a sound effect that is meant to be a lapine foot stamp, an interesting innovation. During an extended musical interlude, Cowslip supervises the carrying of the flayra the human has left back to the warren. Hazel then finds Fiver, who has separated himself. He says they look like squirrels carrying nuts, rather than the dogs carrying sticks of the book. Bigwig finds them, and then comes across a patch of ground where the earth has been disturbed. He then finds a hole, presumably in a hedgerow, and is immediately snared. Their stay at the warren of the snares has been of indeterminate length, but they have seen no shapes or strange greeting dances, nor have they heard these strange rabbits laugh, and Bigwig has not lost his temper with Fiver at all. The saving of Bigwig from the snare is a summarised version of the action of the novel. Fiver's truncated revelation of the true terrifying nature of the warren is punctuated by sounds of realisation from his companions. And then they see Strawberry running towards them. His grief at the loss of Nildro Hayne, believe it or not, is dramatically portrayed here for the first time. He did not appear in the 1978 film, and Nildro Hayne did not appear in the 1984 radio play or the 1999 TV series. Another musical interlude takes us straight to the base of Watership Down, as Fiver insists they must climb it. As the music continues, Dandelion and Silver, rather than Hawkbit, accompany Hazel on his first expedition up the down. And it is Silver who therefore finds the rough holes they could shelter in part way up the slope. And then, later on, Blackberry, as in the novel, suggests digging in the small wood higher up where the tree roots will have broken up the soil. He also suggests the revolutionary idea of bucks actually digging. And so, for the first time, the warren on Watership Down being dug from scratch, as it was in the book, is portrayed dramatically. Hayes also suggested digging the honeycomb, having been inspired by the large bower at the Warren of the Snares when Holly arrives, seemingly at the top of the down, with the musical refrain in the background for effect. Because of the nature of the music, the effect is more sad than supernatural. Holly does not have Bluebell with him. In fact, the 1984 play has the only portrayal of Bluebell up to this point. Holly also does not seem to be in the same state as he is in the book, apart from his ripped ear. In the newly dug honeycomb, which is not given that name here, Hazel congratulates them all for completing it, before handing over to Holly, who tells them what happened to Sandalford. In the absence of Bluebell, we only hear Holly's above-ground account of those dreadful events. Having seen his warren destroyed, Holly travels alone rather than with 3 other survivors, and we hear a flashback to his encounter with Cowslip's warren, which he escapes from with a ripped ear. After being pursued, he tackles Cowslip further on, who saves himself by saying where the rabbits he is looking for have gone. This last encounter is true to the book, as is Holly's reconciliation with Bigwig. A brief musical interlude leads us into the discovery of Quihar by Silver and Bigwig. This Quihar is in the usual tradition of laughing at a funny foreigner and sounds Germanic to my British ears. This is also, incidentally, the last portrayal of Quihar that will be played in this way. With more modern sensitivities has come a reluctance to play foreign accents for comedy. I won't comment on whether or not that is a good or a bad thing. Quihar agrees to be helped by the rabbits, and after an interlude, Bigwig tells Hazel everything he has learnt from Quihar, and Hazel realises how useful he could be. He calls a full meeting of the warren, unlike in the novel where he just tends to discuss things with small groups. At this meeting he lays out the plan for Quihar to search for other warrens with does. Bigwig successfully speaks to Quihar about this, and he sets off immediately. After a light interlude he is back. He has found mudders in 2 places. The nearby farm, where there are rabbits in boxes, and near a river in the other direction, a town of rabbits. This conversation is very close to the book. Hazel proposes the same party of 4 journey to the large warren. They will set off the next day. And now a departure from the book, but in an odd way. The tales of El Khara have been entirely absent until now, but now Hazel proposes that they gather in the Great Hall, as the honeycomb seems to have been named, and hear one told by Dandelion. In the Great Hall, to a stamping of feet, Dandelion begins the tale of the blessing of El Khara, which was told in the middle of the woods before reaching the Enborn in the book. His pronunciation of the name is a bit off, more like Ella Rayra, but this is still the first time an actor has gotten to say it in this production. The story is told in a fairly full form, and it is nice to hear this, rather than just dramatising it. Good storytelling is its own art form, as any respectable rabbit would agree. It is later, and Hazel asks Dandelion to come to the farm with him rather than Pipkin. This seems to be because Pipkin is a non-speaking part in this version. At the farm, Hazel speaks with Haystack the doe first rather than Boxwood the buck. We are 50 minutes into a 2-hour play and hear our first female voice. This is also true to the book. There are only 2 does in the hutch, Haystack and Clover. The 2 bucks are absent. These hutch rabbits know how to open their hutch when they feel safe coming out. Clover is immediately keen to escape and persuades Haystack as well. Their conversation is uninterrupted, and therefore, after 50 minutes of no female voices, this production suddenly, briefly, passes the Bechdel-Wallace test. The does are also given additional agency by not needing to be freed from the hutch. All of this summarises the plot even more, as there will be no need for a return raid to free them. Dandelion has spotted the dog asleep. Inevitably it wakes up as they leave the barn, and then Ehrududu arrives. The does begin to go tharn, so Hazel tells them to close their eyes and run. We hear 2 male humans describe what they are seeing, and then one tells the other to shoot one of the wild rabbits. We hear the shot. Approaching Watership Down, Dandelion and the 2 does meet Fiver, and so it is he rather than Blackberry who gives Fiver the bad news. Fiver has seen the fourth ghostly rabbit behind them and immediately knows Hazel isn't dead. In the book, this ghost of Hazel isn't such a positive sign, and Fiver has a sleeping vision in his grief before realising Hazel is alive. But here, part 1 of the 2002 radio play closes with Fiver certain Hazel has not been killed. Is it canon? Sorry, let's try that again. Comparison with the book. This section last appeared on the podcast in episode 89, which was released on November 11th, 2022, and looked at the end of the 1978 film. Since then, we have been looking at expansions of the Watership Down universe from the original story, but now we are back for the foreseeable future with portrayals of the original story as told in the 1972 novel. So, rather than asking whether or not these portrayals are canon, it seems more appropriate to simply ask how close they are to that original story. You can draw your own conclusions as to whether or not this makes them canon. First of all, it has to be said that the summarising of the plot, at least in this first section, is no more extreme than in the 1978 film, and this also extends to the inclusion of only one tale of El Carrera, both of which move it from its place in the book. Apart from that, this portrayal only deletes sections of the original story. It does not change their order. The 1978 film swapped the road and the beanfield, and also had Holly encounter Ephrafa on his way to Watership Down. I made my feelings clear about that at the time. This version, while keeping the correct order of events, perhaps misses out too much of the journey to Watership Down, but this might just be my bias. If I were going to criticise the portrayal of a character in this version, it would be to say that it achieves the rare feat of making Bigwig too nice. Bigwig is the character who is most often misportrayed. He is usually made a buffoon or a thug, neither of which is a fair portrayal of him, and only the 1978 film came close to getting him right. But here, he is just a bit too pleasant, which is unusual. Bigwig does have an edge to him, which you would expect from the rabbit who bested Woundwort. Also, curiously, here he has a slight West Country accent that his fellow rabbits from the same warren do not have. However, apart from that, personally, I found the portrayal of our beloved rabbits acceptable in this version. I just wish Pipkin had got to speak. And for me, a highlight was the portrayal of the warren on Watership Down having not already been dug for the new arrivals. The first time this had been dramatically portrayed accurately. Overall then, an enjoyable listen that pays appropriate respect to its source material. Next time, we look at part 2 of the 2002 BBC radio play.